Welcome to this video tutorial regarding complex sentences. I'm your host, Viviana Bon, and I will guide you on how to identify, explain, and analyze subordinate clauses on examples found in the classic novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. This is Charlotte Brontë. She is one of the four famous Brontë sisters. Her most well-known work is Jane Eyre, published in 1847. The book follows the story of Jane, a seemingly plain and ordinary girl as she battles through life's struggles. The obstacles that are present in her life are her cruel and abusive aunt, the awful conditions at Lowood School, her love for Rochester, and Rochester's marriage to another woman. Now, after this short introduction of the novel, let's get into the main idea of this video tutorial: complex sentences and subordinate clauses. To begin with, what is a complex sentence? A complex sentence is a sentence that contains an independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence, but a dependent or subordinate clause, even though it has a subject and a verb, cannot stand alone. Now, how do we identify a subordinate clause? Well, they are separated into three types: noun clauses, relative clauses, and adverbial clauses. Noun clauses are dependent clauses. They function and act as a noun. They are also introduced by a subordinator. Then we have relative clauses. They are dependent clauses that precede and modify a noun or a pronoun. They are often introduced by the subordinators whose, who, which, that, where, and when. And last but not least, we have the adverbial clauses, which are dependent clauses that function and act as an adverb. They modify the main verb that is present on the clause. Now that we know all of this, let's get into the examples that were found on the novel. First, we found this relative clause. Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. In this complex sentence, we have a relative clause. Eliza is the antecedent, which means that Eliza is the subject of the main clause and who we are referring to on the relative clause by saying who. The relative clause is non-defining, which means that it's adding extra information between commas. Who is the relative pronoun that introduces the relative clause, which means that it's a relative pronoun used as a noun. And the verb agreement, which is when the subject and verb agree between being singular or plural, in this case is singular, because we have Eliza, which is singular, and was, which is also singular. This is a noun clause. You said I could not unless I married you. In this complex sentence, the main clause is you said I could not, and the subordinate clause is unless I married you. The type of subordinate clause in this sentence is a noun clause. It is introduced by the subordinator unless, which is a subordinating conjunction that indicates exception. The function of this clause is direct object because it answers a what question, which in this case is what did you say? I said that I could not unless I married you. The context in which this noun clause is found is after the modal verb could not. And finally, the main use of this clause is a statement because you told me directly that I could not unless I married you. Here we have another relative clause. I wanted to feel the thoughts whose force he seemed bursting and resisting. In this complex sentence, we have a relative clause where the antecedent is thoughts, for it is the subject and what we are referring to on the subordinate clause by saying whose. The relative clause is defining, since the information is essential to the meaning of the main clause. The verb agreement is plural for thoughts, and the conjugated verb in the relative clause, seemed, influence, is in simple past. The function of the subordinator in the relative clause is relative pronoun as a subject, since the antecedent is a noun. Now we are analyzing an adverbial clause. I was shut up in a room where there is a ghost till after dark. In this complex sentence, the independent clause is I was shut up in a room, and the dependent clause is where there is a ghost till after dark. The type of subordinate clause is an adverbial clause of place. The adverbial clause is introduced by the subordinator where, which is a relative adverb, giving information about the place and therefore modifying the whole clause. Another relative clause is the candle, whose ray had been my beacon, burnt on the table. In this complex sentence, we have a relative clause. Here, the antecedent is candle, since it is the object in the main clause. The relative clause is introduced by the relative pronoun whose, that indicates possession, and it is an undefined relative clause since it is adding extra information between commas. And the verb agreement, which is when the subject and verb agree between being singular or plural, in this case is singular because we have candle, which is singular, and had, which is also singular. Our last clause is an adverbial one. He handed her over as if she had been a lapdog. In this complex sentence, we have an adverbial clause. The independent clause is he handed her over, and the dependent clause is as if she had been a lapdog. The type of subordinate clause is an adverbial clause of manner. The adverbial clause is introduced by the subordinator as if, which is a subordinating conjunction that indicates how the action of the main verb is performed, therefore modifying the whole clause. And this is how we end our little session. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in another video to learn more about syntactical analysis of the English language. Goodbye!